if someone plays the Ponziani opening against you, you should be happy because probably they're going to walk straight into your attack. Hi, this is Dr. Siddharth Yadav, and on today's episode of Chess for Pandas, we will have a look at how to punish the Ponziani opening. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Now, the Ponziani starts after the move e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and c3. Now, White's idea is pretty simple. They want to play d4 and maintain a strong duo in the center with e4, d4. However, the move c3 has a lot of downsides as well. So the knight cannot develop to c3, which prevents White's control of the critical d5 square. And also, it's not threatening the e5 pawn. So for example, in the Ruy Lopez, when you play bishop to b5, you're actually threatening the knight here, which undermines this particular thing. So there's immediate tension in between. Also in the Italian, you're already eyeing the f7 square, and that creates further problems. So Ponziani is not directly threatening anything. And that's the reason that black has two decent replies, knight f6 and d5. And although both of them have a pretty decent theoretical stature, I would prefer the move knight f6 to create more problems for White. Now, I'm not going to cover any moves that are protecting this particular e4 pawn because our knight move is threatening the particular pawn. I'm not going to look at moves like queen c2 or d3 or bishop d3. I think bishop d3 is called the Kopek system. I'm not really sure. I read it quite some time back. But I'm not going to cover these moves for two reasons. First of all, they're not really popular, and also they're not very threatening to black. And that's the reason why we will move ahead with the main move d4. Now after d4, again, black is at a crossroads. He can decide how he wants to deal with this pressure on the e4 pawn. Now I suggest that we directly take the e4 pawn because that's what we bought our knight out for. And that's that. Although I should mention that there is this other line where black essentially captures e takes d4, and then there is this variation with e5, knight d5. And yeah, I mean, if you want, you can read about this and you can play this variation. A good resource will be Bologan's Black Weapons in the open game. I think he deals with this variation in quite some depth. So you can check that out surely if you don't want to play the attack that we are about to commence. But I recommend playing knight takes e4. And now let's look at some of the alternative moves before we go to the main move, which is d5. d5 is the overwhelming majority. You'll get it in more than 85% of your games, but let's look at a few other moves. Amongst the lesser options is d takes e5. Now, d takes e5 is quite simple to meet because after bishop c5, we are already threatening something on the f2 square. And after something like bishop e3, chop chop, and d5, obviously if the pawn takes, the knight can obviously capture back. We arrive at a position where d3 is the most common played move, the bishop d3 move. Although I don't really like these pawns, which are kind of bad in appearance. After castle, castle, and bishop g4, knight d2, these are all just natural developing moves. Takes, takes. And after something like rook g3 and c6, I really like our position. We have an extra pawn. White has a pretty sickly pawn here on e3, and I quite like this position. Although I should mention that after bishop c5, White does have a few other moves. So let's say knight d4. In this position, I really like the move queen h4, immediately putting the pressure on the f2 square. And after something like, okay, let's look at why g3 doesn't work. Obviously, it's because of takes, takes, check, and we win the rook. So g3 cannot be played in this situation. So bishop f3 seems like another decent move. But here we just chop the pawn, and then this bishop b4 check. It's very tricky. It seems like a very normal, natural position, but obviously you cannot play here because of this. You cannot play the knight to c3. So a very common move is simply to play knight to d2. But after check, it's actually quite tricky because this will simply be mate. If you take with the bishop, you don't want to take with the queen because you simply lose the queen. And if you don't do anything, well, then I've just captured your knight for nothing, right? So that's another problem that white players can have. Also, if they just move their king to e2, we have this move, knight f2. The reason being that after bishop takes, we have queen g4, and the king can not go to e1 or d2 to protect the queen. So the king has to come up and the queen is taken for free. And that will be that. So this is one of the reasons why I don't really like this variation where they chop off the pawn with d takes e5. Another variation could be knight takes e5. Now this is slightly more tricky than the other one, but it still shouldn't be much of a problem. So we just chop the knight, and now immediately recapturing the piece with d takes e5 runs into that same bishop c5 problems again. And after things like bishop e3, 3 and check, obviously you cannot play g3 because we just chop it. And after something like king e2 and d5, black is in a super comfortable position and probably just winning outright. So this is also something that white cannot really play. A tricky move here is queen e2 because both our knights are lined up to our king, and it's a really easy way for white to exploit this fact. We play d5, protecting, well, one of the knights. And now if d takes e5, there are several positions, several moves that have been played by black. But I really like, I think it was Martin Lokander who gave this suggestion of playing g6. Now the idea is there are two plans here. The first plan is the bishop g7 and castle plan, which puts pressure on the e7 pawn. The other plan is c3 and queen a5, which also puts pressure on the queen side if white is to develop there. And I like both the plans, and this seems like a good position for black and a comfortable position. Let's look at a sample line with knight d2. We chop off the knight, bishop g7, queenside castles, kingside castles, f4, protecting the e5 pawn, and c5. Now, white can actually play this, like there are two good moves here. One of them is to go with king to b1 so as to preempt the move queen to a5. The other one is to play g3 and bishop g2, which also is a very sensible option of just continuing to develop and connect the rooks. But let me just show you what happens if white gets too aggressive and plays something like h4. Queen a5. We're immediately trying to threaten the pawn. Ignoring our threat with h5 is not in the best of interest for white because we take h takes g6, queen a1 check, king c2, bishop b5 check, king b3, c4 check, b4, queen takes, and it's basically a forced mate that's coming up on the board. And there we go. The king is mated right here in the center, and there's nothing that white could do about it. So after queen a5, if they make the prophylactic move king b1, all right, we simply play h5, and we have our own trump cards here. It will not be extremely easy to open up the h file or the f file without getting some sort of a counterplay with the bishop. So all in all, it's a balanced position, but I would obviously prefer black here. So this is one of the moves that you can play. Another move, which is like a very silly one but requires some tactical imagination, is the move f3 in this position. Now the f3 move is again taking advantage of the fact that we are pinned heavily on the e file. And okay, you can try to move the knight here, or something like that. But a tactical solution, which if you don't really know, it will be difficult for you to spot on the spot, is queen h4 check. Now the point being, g3 and your standard knight takes g3 is not good enough, because after takes and we block it, the white queen can simply do this weird maneuver, and white is simply winning here. So we can't play that. But what we can do is this really strange move, knight to d3 check. Now it's very interesting, because if queen takes, then we have this very familiar knight takes g3. But let's say if the queen doesn't take and the king moves, we have this sensational move, queen f6. And I say sensational because in another variation, queen f6 is also going to be a fantastic move. So after queen f6, well, both our knights are en prise, but none of them can be taken. This knight can't be taken because of this check, and the knight on e cannot be taken because of, I'll give you some time to think. Here is the move, bishop to g4, because after takes we have this check and we are forking the king and queen again. So amazing tactical display, but this is something that we have to know beforehand. All right, so this was about the knight takes e4 variation. Now we are ready to move into the main meat of the chapter, which is the move d5. Now after d5, before telling you what I recommend in this position, let me just go through a very natural way of how black would play this, right? So our knight is attacked currently, right? So we move the knight. That should be a very natural thing to do. We don't want to move it to the edge of the board unless there's a reason. So we simply play knight to e7, and white captures the pawn in the center. Now, knight g6 is a theory recommended move of how to play in this exact position, but d6 looks very natural, especially in shorter time controls. We are simply threatening the knight. So after the knight moves back, let's say, we'll be able to develop our bishop, our queen, and probably castle queenside, or just carry on with the development. Here comes the most famous Ponziani trap ever, and this is the dream for most Ponziani players. It's bishop b5 check. Obviously you cannot block because you simply lose the queen in this particular fashion, so you have to play c6. And after dc6, if you take back, well, then you have this classic fork of the king and the rook. Sorry, kind of drunk there. So with the king and the rook, that's the classic fork. So after d takes c6, a lot of black players take back, but then c takes b7 is a discovered check, and we're also threatening the rook. And after something like, white basically just has two queens now, and it's a completely winning position, and black is busted. So this is the trap that Ponziani players are hoping for. Another slightly elaborate variation of this trap is if you don't take the pawn and you don't take the knight, but you go queen b6, because you're threatening the mate on the f2 square. So in this particular position, white can take and the king can move. And now the main point is you cannot take and make a queen because there's a mate on f2. But white has this super sneaky move with knight f7 check. The king has to move. And now, oh, I think I'm really drunk today. No, so taking the rook and promoting to a knight. That is a fantastic move. And it's forking the king and the queen. And after something like this, white is simply a queen up, and black's position is absolutely shattered. And there's nothing that we can do about this. So these are the traps that the white players are hoping for. There are others, but this is the most common one. So obviously we don't go down that rabbit hole, and we Well, if we don't go down that rabbit hole, what do we do? Because our knight is attacked. We sack the knight with bishop c5. This is known as the Vukovic Gambit, or the Fraser defense, whatever you want to call it. I call it the Ponziani killer, because a lot of the Ponziani players, especially if they've learned their opening theory from YouTube videos, which is kind of ironic because that's what I'm trying to show you, but I digress. So a lot of the players who have a shallow understanding of the opening don't even know about this move. And when I've played it over the board, I've only gotten the chance to play it once over the board, but online I've played it several times. The surprise factor is actually real. In blitz or shorter time controls, people just think that you have missed the fact that the knight can be taken. In slightly longer controls, they are absolutely puzzled by this move and they don't know exactly what's happening. So the surprise value for this move is quite high. And even if the opponent knows about this move and is aware about it, here is the good thing. This is not a trap. I'm not teaching you some trappy line against the Ponziani. This is the best move in the position. So bishop c5 is actually the engine approved move, and it's actually just objectively better than almost all the moves in the position. And because of that, even if your opponent knows about this, they're still going to play against the best move. So it's not that they'll be able to diffuse your trap, because there's nothing to diffuse. Now after bishop c5, the most testing move obviously is to simply take the knight and ask black for what kind of composition it has. But before we get into that, let's look at another really famous or common move which beginners play because they think, oh my god, I'm probably gonna fall into some sort of a trap. Let me just protect my f2 square. Bishop e3 is actually a pretty sad move, because after takes, now we can simply drop back our knight and there's no trap here. After knight takes e5, we don't want to play d6 here, because in the previous variation we had our bishop on f8 and we couldn't castle, but in this position we'll just directly castle. So there's no trap that Ponziani players are having, so they're probably already pretty sad at this particular point. Bishop d3, the most common move. White basically wants to castle, so he moves the bishop out while attacking our knight in the process. But we don't really care about the knight. We played knight to d5. Knight takes d5. And the simple point is that after bishop e4, we have this check picking up the bishop. So the bishop really can't take the knight. Castle is the best move. And now you might be thinking, uh-oh, isn't knight takes e3 a good move because it's threatening both the rook and the queen? It is. It's a decent move, but it doesn't really lead to any sort of an advantage for black. And in fact, with some accurate play, I think that it's really possible that white will simply be better in a few of the variations. So queen f3 is a really strong one. So if you take the knight, if the knight takes the rook, queen e4, and now here we see the problem. The knight is actually trapped. It can't really move anywhere. And white has a pretty strong threat of just checkmating us on the h7 square. After something like f5, queen d5 check, king h8, and bishop takes f1, I will prefer white in this position. There is a threat of knight f7 looming, and we'll have to play something like queen f6 or something like that. And I don't really like this position for black. So this is the reason why we shouldn't get too greedy and start recapturing everything that we see inside. Over here, then you must be thinking, okay, can we have to protect our knight because it's getting taken. So can we move something like knight to f6 or something like that? Yes, you can, but here is a much stronger move. Queen g5. Now, in these variations, we are reintroducing our threat of taking and winning the exchange. But at the same time, the queen is threatening the e3 pawn and also the knight. So it becomes pretty deadly for white to handle this. One simple way white can probably try to resolve the problems is bishop takes e4. But after queen e3 check, king h1, queen takes e4, rook e1, knight e3, which is a pretty sweet move. Queen e2 takes, and after huge exchanges, we can see that we are just 2 pawns up. And here I recommend, like you just saw, b6. We simply want to develop our bishop, and something like rook e7 can actually be ignored with basically bishop b7, because after takes, we have this forced exchange, and now the rook enters the second file. And after rook g1, rook b2, we are already 2 pawns up. The pawn on a2 is going to fall as well, so I don't really like this position. Another variation that we have in this position after queen g5 is, what if the knight goes to c4? It's kind of protecting this particular thing. So we still go with knight takes e3, knight takes e3, queen e3 check, king h1, knight f2 check, rook f2, queen f2. And now this is a position that I have seen black players lose, although this shouldn't be the case. We are an exchange up, and we also have extra pawns, so we shouldn't probably be losing this position. But because nothing except the queen is developed, sometimes I've seen black player come under some sort of a counterattack. So let me just give you quick guidance on what happens. The knight probably will be developed to d2. You play d6. We want to free up our bishop. After knight e4, which threatens the queen, drop the queen back to e2. b6 is possible, but then the problem is that the queen won't be able to swing really freely to the king side, because all the white forces will basically be looking to attack on the king side, and queen b6, the d6 pawn, will be hindering this maneuver. So let's play queen e3, queen f1, basically allowing the rook to come here with tempo. We play bishop d7. We want to connect our rooks and get one of the rooks to the e file. After rook e1, queen h6, knight g3, rook a e8. And I think black should be able to consolidate this position without a lot of effort. The only pair of rooks probably will be exchanged. If not, then black will have control of the e file with the rook. And I think black should be able to convert this in a game. So this is probably the best course of event that can happen after knight to c4, instead of bishop e4, that is. So this is what happens if white doesn't take the knight and instead goes bishop e3. So we just take the bishop and we'll play knight e7 and castles. All right, now let's look at the main move, which is d takes c6. Simply capturing the knight and asking black, show me what you got. So in the next episode, we'll have a look at what happens when white decides to take up the challenge and basically take our knight. There will be a lot more sacrifices there. There will be positions when black is completely winning despite being 2 pieces down, and white has to survive the minefield that black has set up for him. And despite looking at several positions where white has probably solved all his problems, black will have one trick after the other to solve all of the problems. So it's a really exciting variation, and I hope you join me for the next episode where we try to punish the Ponziani in the main line after d takes c6. So if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing so that you don't miss out on my other opening surveys, and have a look at these 2 videos, which I think you might find really interesting. See you next time.